Live from the Clarity from Chaos studios, heard worldwide, it's Dave Campbell. On every episode, Dave and his guests explore, discuss, and work on solutions to some of life's biggest challenges. So, if you're ready, be prepared to be enlightened, amused, and even shocked by what you hear. And now, the real, the authentic, the one and only Dave Campbell.
Welcome back, everyone, to Clarity from Chaos. I'm your host, Dave Campbell. Extraordinarily little is known about today's farmers, with the exception about everybody screaming about the price of eggs. The only scant news you hear is every once in a while you hear about the U.S. selling off farmland to China, but it doesn't talk about any of the implications. It very rarely talks about the inheritance tax problems or anything else that goes along with the family farm or corporate America eating family farms alive. So to discuss this crisis facing the family farm, we're incredibly pleased to have the author of Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope, and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer, Mr. Brian Reisinger. Brian grew up on a farm in Wisconsin and worked along with his father, only to leave to the world of journalism and public policy. He currently is the President and Chief Content Officer of Midwestern-based Platform Communications. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Hey, good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start out with kind of a 50,000-foot overview of the history of farming. I mean, everybody understands that, in the beginning, they were all farms. It wasn't industrialized and all that.
Yeah.
But let's start with, where you would like to take a step and explain to the audience some of the things that are going on right now with the farms.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're so right. I mean, at one time, this country was so very different. And the way
Right.
things are now, it's really shifted to a world where most of our food isn't something that we're connected with anymore. And so modern farming is something that is much more distant from the people who eat the food than it used to be. That's really the state of play these days. And that happened through the course of the past century of our farms disappearing. What I found in my book is that, farms really began to disappear about 100 years ago, right around the time of the Depression. It was a little bit before that. Really
Right.
hasn't stopped since. And you're so right that it's part of a shift of our country from being rural to urban. And now we have a world where the American farmer and the American consumer are much more disconnected than they used to be. And it's been a huge change.
Yeah, I mean, people, it amazes me, Brian, that people don't even understand where milk comes from, or where the hamburger comes from at McDonald's,
Yeah.
or anything else. And I remember vividly, because I grew up on a farm too, of land banks.
Yeah.
Land banks. I remember distinctly when, and I can't remember whose presidency we were under, but the dairy farmers were dumping milk in the ditches because they couldn't sell it.
Yep.
And I don't think people really, they just, it's like aspirin. They just go to the store and know that the food's going to be there.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. People think their food comes from stores,
Yeah.
You're touching on something that is a story that we tell in the book. I mean, in the 1930s, farmers were dumping milk. It was a form of striking. And it was happening again in the 70s and 80s during the farm crisis, the 1980s. And my dad had guys coming down the road trying to get him to dump his milk. And, it was one of those things where it just showed the level of strife. And it really shows something I think unique about farming, which is that, the American farmer is both a small business owner, that entrepreneur, and the American farmer is that working class guy just trying to get by. And, and walking the line between being those two things is something that's a little bit unique in our history. And I think a lot of people have missed that. We try to tell those stories in the book as best we can to show, whether it's weather that blesses or threatens, whether it's farmland accidents, whether it's economic upheaval, whatever it is, we try to tell the story to show people what it's been like, while also uncovering some of the hidden areas that have driven the disappearance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people even probably fully comprehend that the futures market, in as much as was created to augment farming, so that farmers could hedge against weather and other elements, right, to where they weren't completely caught flat-footed. They
Yep.
were, they were able to mitigate the risk, if you will,
Yep.
of being on a farm. But then, over the last, I probably want to say the last 20 or 30 years, corporate America has been eating family farms alive because they haven't been able to survive. And then you had the advent of COVID, which cracked everything up. And so and now probably, I don't know if your book catches it, but bird flu and the destruction of the chicken industry, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what we're seeing right now with bird flu is something that we also saw during COVID, and that is the supply chain vulnerability
Right.
issue.
Yep.
And we've got people, farmers, different facilities that are producing the food that in many cases aren't able to sell it because the supply chain is locked up. And then on the other side of it, you've got consumers that aren't able to get the food that they need. And if it is, the price is through the roof. That's what happened during COVID, really. And we've got these highly concentrated industries that if you have one distribution center that goes down or one processing facility that goes down, it has an outsized impact on that food supply, and it really shuts down part of that supply chain. And that's the crisis that we're facing now is we've got a supply chain that's a modern miracle, but it also is deeply vulnerable. And if we don't address that, it's going to affect not only the security of our food, the price of our food, the health of our food. It's everything to this country.
Well, yeah, and they're finally starting to wake up, Brian, to the fact that they've thrown all of their chips in with China relative to the pharmaceutical industry, rare earth metals, and all kinds of stuff. But there's very little discussed about the food chain. How food comes from your dad's farm to the Kroger's, right? And how that happens. And China's actually gotten themselves involved in the food processing part of it and everything else. But there's very little talk about addressing that distribution piece. Very little.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we haven't figured out as a country that we have an issue with that supply chain, and that affects not only rural America where we're trying to grow and produce the food, but it affects every single American dinner table. And then you get into the other ways that the Chinese have gotten their hands into our food system. You've got north of 300,000 acres owned by the Chinese Communist Party right now. Entities that go back to, all the companies in China are controlled by the CCP. And they are getting...
And then you take a step further back and they're controlled by the senators and the congressmen in Washington, D.C., right? So, you could take that whole thing full circle, right?
Yeah, the link may go too far back for me to trace, but I can tell you that it's not something that the American people want. And it is something that we can get some real bipartisan concern around and make some changes around if we can get people's attention on it, because it's really an outrage, honestly.
Well, I don't think the new Secretary of Agriculture has addressed it. They're going after, I think the first thing they were going to do was ensure that the price of eggs came down. God forbid. But I haven't heard anything or seen anything about the new secretary addressing the supply chain issues, Brian. I don't know, maybe you have.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot that is going on that they're trying to address, and I think that the supply chain issue is one that has just slipped by both our parties, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And it's something that, look, at the end of the day, we had the Democrats who for a long time were supposedly looking out for the little guy, but really government was their answer to everything. And we had Republicans who didn't necessarily keep a handle on what was going on with our industries and who was getting their hands on what. And I think it's a wake-up call that both parties are I hope, in the process of experiencing.
Well, see, farming isn't sexy to a lot of people, right? It's sexy to farmers because it's a beautiful thing to do what farmers do. But a lot of people, they just don't find it sexy. So it gets ignored, right? Unfortunately. until the point where they go to the store and egg prices went from $1 a dozen to $5 a dozen, and then they have an absolute conniption fit,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's incredible because you're so right about that. And then at the same time, I look at the way that America thinks of itself, and you see farming running through that. So many of our ideals,
Oh,
hard work,
absolutely.
values, and the way what I say to people, and it's true too. I think the stories in the book, we try to show this. We're not just losing the farms that feed us; we're losing a part of ourselves. And there's something that connects with people when they realize that piece. It's just getting in front of them.
Well, the agriculture theme, the morality that comes with the hard work, all of the parts and pieces, because you actually see life created, see things created. The full circle of life is experienced by the farmer.
Yeah.
It's not just something on television, because I remember as a young man helping my grandfather, because sheep would get bound up during lamb delivery.
Yep.
And I remember reaching, now this is probably unpleasant to say, but I remember reaching my arm up to my armpit and bringing a lamb out, to
Yep.
birth it. And
Yep.
then, and then bottle feeding the lamb and so on and so forth. So
Yep.
farmers get to see that entire life cycle
Yep.
that urban America has absolutely no bloody ass clue about, other than what they see on television.
Yeah, that's right. You're reading my mail because I talk about that in the book. I talk about my dad getting up with him, working sun up to sundown, seeing the blessings of what you put into the land, growing.
Yeah.
And I talk about that circle of life. I actually talk about my dad getting down into the barn in the middle of the night with a cow that was having a difficulty in labor and helping pull that calf, and how we would stand there and we would see the calf take either its first breaths or lay lifeless. And
Right.
what you learn as a kid and the things that you see generation after
Yep.
generation, and the value of that is just, boy, I'm lucky I was part of it.
Well, I'm lucky I was part of it as well. But I don't know how to impart that onto, because that part got stripped away when it started separating from rural to urban.
Yeah.
And like I said a minute ago, there's nothing sexy about it. It's reality, right?
Yeah.
When you see a lamb born alive, or help it stay alive, or to your point, it is born dead.
Yeah.
There's a realization about life itself
Yeah.
that, like I said, people don't get, because they're glued to their stupid video games, their cell phones, their TV sets. It's a piece of America. Like I said, the morality of it is completely lost on a great deal of people.
Yeah.
And so I think the policies that go with it, Brian, are lost for that very reason, because you really have to understand that, because farming is as sophisticated as any Wall Street banker could be.
Yeah.
The things that you have to know, and the reason I say that, is some time ago I took an 8th grade primer from 1895, 8th grade, 1895, and I have yet to have anybody graduating from college with a BA, MA, or a doctorate pass that 8th grade primer.
No kidding.
And it was standard practice, right? But what it had in it were a lot of the things that we're talking about: life things, farming things,
Yeah.
how to understand the weather by looking up.
Yeah.
Just things that were at to a point intuitive in this country, until the turn of the century. We started industrializing and, quote, making everybody's life better, right?
Right. Yeah, I'll tell you, I mean, you're talking about things that are just ingrained in farming, and at one time would have been extremely common, as you say, and was getting less and less common. I mean, by the time I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was clear that farms have been disappearing for a good long while. And I remember standing in the driveway with my dad. Guys would come in with the pickup truck and they'd say, this farm went under, that farm sold. And I
Right.
had a sense that it was rare. And I would see my dad, and he'd be working with the animals. He'd be checking the crops in the field. He'd look up at the sky. It seemed to me that he had a connection with what was going on in the world around him that was so rare, and it was slipping away. And that's really what stuck with me as I got older.
Right.
Is boy, there's something unique here. It's like Paul Harvey says, so God made a farmer. You see that happening, and you see that slipping away, and that left such an impression on me.
Well, if you're spiritual, farming is all through the Bible.
Yeah,
They don't talk about building Corvettes and stuff like that. They talk about farming issues and raising animals and
yeah,
crops, and that they're not particularly concerned with uh, some of the modern mechanization things that we seem to be addicted to.
yeah.
So let me kind of shift gears a little bit. Um, from a farming stance, do you see, and I'm curious about this answer, Brian, do you see a lot of difference between the Democrats and the Republicans?
Boy, you're asking $1 million question there, and the answer is that both parties for decades have made so many mistakes affecting our
Yeah,
farm.
that's what I
And
was thinking as well.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, people can talk about the different strengths and weaknesses of the different parties, but at the end of the day, the American farmer has seen policy after policy for decades not address what's going on the ground on our farms. And so,
Right.
at the end of the day, I mean, both parties probably need to make a pretty sizable transformation to be
Well,
able
I
to.
think, yeah, I think they like most of urban America have lost touch with their roots. And they're unfortunately their policies are presented that way. They
Yeah,
really, it's kind of like President Obama and his crew designing healthcare, right? It's just you don't have people that are connected to the ground making those policies.
yeah,
And I was just curious, and now unfortunately we have the tariffs. So my wonder is, um, how your view on the tariffs and their effect,
yeah,
because I, I'm not so sure that the corporate media is not overblowing this. I'd be interested in actually talking to farmers about what's going on based on the fact that there's a tariff in Canada and they can't sell their goods across the border and so on and so forth.
yeah. I was talking with people about this back home just today, and the reality is that the farmers are caught in a political crosswind here,
Yeah,
where the American farmer looks at the situation with world trade and knows that unfair trade has been depressing prices and screwing them for decades. And at the same time, you'll hear the ag groups and you'll hear some of the farmers say that, we get into trade disputes and we have too many tariffs flying back and forth. Maybe a tariff is a way to draw a hard line, which could be a good thing. But on the other hand, a tariff from another country increases the costs of those American farm goods, makes it harder to sell abroad, and that hits the farmer too. And so
right.
the farmer is really caught in the middle here. And I think that, a lot of people I talk to are hoping that, drawing a hard line on the tariffs will allow us to negotiate new trade deals. But in between, there's
Where's
pain.
the where's the relief going to come from
That's it.
to weather that storm? And I think, and you can correct me here, I think I heard Trump mention something about relief going to the farmers, but like everything in the media, Brian, it got washed away with
Yeah.
the next 15-second soundbite, and I haven't seen anything more about it. And I was just curious if the people that you're talking to have been hearing that.
Yeah. Yeah. They've been watching it, and there's a lot of talk about, the assistance that's going to come. And that message has been put out. And, we have to see where it's going to go. It's an extremely dynamic and rapidly changing situation. But at the end of the
Right.
day, we need to make sure we don't lose sight of what's going on our farms on the ground and how these policies affect them. Because at the end of the day, now here's a number for it. We've been losing 45,000 farms per year on average for the past century. And if we keep losing them at that pace, we're going to lose most of our family farms in the next 40 years. And so we
Next
do need
4 years or 40?
Next 40 years, next generation.
Yeah, next generation. Yeah.
Yep. By the time my little girl is the same age as me, if we don't make a change.
Yeah, that's pretty frightening. And then we're beholden to what, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're talking about farm being too big to fail. How few farms do we need in this country? You know what I mean? Is it we got do we need 5,000, 1,000, 5 farms? How few will it take? And we don't want to test that.
Well, quite frankly, I'd rather see the urbanization roll back towards the farming than the other way around. I'd rather see metropolises start to diminish and farms start to grow, because the ethics that are gained on a farm are just extraordinary. They're extraordinary as children get to deal with that, because it's, to me, it's life altering to be able to witness and participate in life itself, right?
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And we've had the opposite going on for a very long time. We've had farms slipping away now for a century. We've had farms, the communities were built by farms shrinking. We've had jobs disappearing from rural America. And the reality is that as you have that happen, it's a hollowing out. And it divides us further and further, as you're noting, rural from urban. And it doesn't need to be that way. And I will say that there aren't a lot of good things that come out of the pandemic, but one good thing came out of it is you did have people realize they could be mobile, and that they didn't have to be lashed to their desk in the city or wherever it was. And we started to have some rural communities start to grow again, start to have returning population.
Right.
I'm really hopeful that we can forge a deeper connection between rural and urban, where people can see where their food comes from, and people can be connected with that way of life if they want to be. We've got some people's attention. We need more people's attention.
Well, and I currently live in a small town, and last Saturday I just went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning, right? And bought eggs and some specialty meats and stuff like that from the local farms, right?
Yep.
So, and we're seeing, unfortunately, because I'd rather it stay small, we're starting to see, to your point, an explosion of people migrating out of the particular city that's north of me towards the rural side of the house.
Yeah.
And I on my way to church, I drive by a guy that's raising llamas, so I'm sure that he's going to be doing alpaca wool at some point. So those kinds of things are starting to pop back up again.
Yep. There's a lot of people out there that realize they're missing something. They realize they're missing something, and they are, maybe finding it in some of the heart of this country, and I'm somebody who goes back and forth, as you may know. I have one foot at the family farm in Wisconsin, and I've got another foot here in, of all places, Northern California, near my wife's family.
Right.
And when I'm back in Wisconsin, I live in the family farm. When we're in California, we live in the Sacramento area, the farm to fork capital of the world. So I get the chance, the opportunity, if you want to call it that, to see the farming in the Midwest, the food movement in California, and try to see the connection there. Right. And my hope is that more people can begin to see that connection and understand it, because that's how we're going to change things. We're going to have people start to understand that these things affect their food.
Well, yeah, and I wish there was more. I don't want to say publicity, but more things pointed in that direction, so people started to get a sense of that. Because I think, if you do the Johnny on the street routine, you're going to run into people that, like I said, think everything comes from Kroger, right? They just go out the back door and bring it in. Yeah. They don't think about Bob getting up at 3:00 in the morning to milk the cows, and the truck picking and going to milk processing and packaging and all of, they don't think about any of that. They just think it comes in the back door somehow, right?
That's right. I talk to a lot of people who don't know where the food comes from, and I make them feel a little better by saying, hey, even when I was a little kid, I thought the chocolate milk come from the brown cows. I learned
Yeah,
otherwise a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny because my kids grew up on goat milk,
Was
and
that right?
and yeah, and I did it specifically because I didn't particularly like the processing of normal cow's
Sure.
milk, because when I was on the farm, we had raw milk,
Right.
and it's funny because our hamburgers, I always used to think our hamburgers were just normal hamburgers until I started eating hamburgers away from the farm, only to find out that we had been grinding sirloin into our
Yeah.
hamburgers, and I had no knowledge that I was getting top shelf hamburgers, and
Yeah.
that's what I grew up on, right? So it's extremely amazing, the way it all seems to come together.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the current administration and its effect on farming? Do you think they're going to make some strides forward, or you think it's just going to be status quo?
Well, I think they're going to shake things up. I think the status quo is being shaken and is going to continue to get shook. And,
Yeah.
the question of where we go here, every single administration represents opportunity and
Huh.
challenge for farmers. That's just a reality, whatever way the winds are blowing. This administration is one that is going to make some changes. They're showing that with the tariffs. They're talking a lot about what they're going to do to government programs. And what I always say to people is, you gotta lean in, and you gotta hear your voice heard. And there was a lot of support for President Trump from farm country, from rural areas.
Right.
And the louder that the farmer's voice is, the more they're going to get heard, and thus they're going to get overlooked. And so I'm always urging people to make sure that, hey, as they're making these changes, as they're pursuing these trade deals, as they're adjusting these programs, make sure that they're hearing you. And the reality of the situation is that it took both parties to break things. And it's going to take people in both parties and everybody in between to try to get us going on the right track. And it's going to be a long haul.
Yeah, I think that's what people, at least in my view, that's what people need to settle on, is this mess didn't happen over the last 100 days.
Yeah.
This mess has been going on for the last 40 or 50 years.
Yeah.
And it's not going to get resolved in the next 2 weeks. Like everybody's screaming about the price of eggs. Well, they screwed around for 4 years to get the price of eggs where they were at. I think it's a little disingenuous to holler about the price of eggs in some administration's first 3 weeks. It just seems a little silly, but of course that's human nature, right?
Yeah, that's right. You're going to have one party blaming the other, and that's the way it's going to go
Oh yeah,
round and round.
yeah, yeah. I think I'm going to touch base on this, and I probably will regret it. But what are your views on immigration? Because there's an awful lot of discourse around things aren't going to get picked because we're exporting back out of the country that labor force. So your views on that, because I don't see that big of an impact myself. But
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in principle, it's a situation where farmers are once again kind of caught in some cross-cutting political winds. You got a
right,
lot of people in rural areas who support securing the border, and you also got a lot of people who do have immigrant labor who are working for them and picking their vegetables or whatever the case may be.
right,
And at the end of the day, they say that about half of farm labor comes from immigrant labor. But I don't think that on the ground the farms have necessarily seen that big of a change yet, and I think it probably has to do with what they're saying about targeting criminal elements as they're
first, yeah,
going after folks, as
yeah,
far as their legal status. Now, we'll see where it goes. I think where things will get more challenging will be as we get into harvest season and you got a lot of hand picked crops, fruits and vegetables and things like that. We're we're going to have to see what happens there. That could get more challenging at that time. So.
Yeah, and those truck farms are mostly out west. I don't know
Yeah.
that there's that many truck farms like in the Midwest because it's all mechanized, right?
Yeah.
Wheat, potatoes, all that stuff is pretty mechanized.
Yeah.
But the vegetables, the cantaloupe and all that stuff is Arizona, California, so on
Yeah.
and so forth. So,
Right.
all right. Well, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you about it. Your book's incredible. And by the way, everybody, we've been talking to Brian Reisinger, who's the author of the new book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. And I strongly suggest you read it and start to get a sense of if you grew up on a farm, then you can reminisce. If you didn't grow up on a farm, then you can wish you'd grown up on a farm. And where can they find the book?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. People can find Land Rich, Cash Poor on Amazon or anywhere else that buy books online. It's also nationwide in bookstores in all your local communities. And I just hope people, maybe connect with the story and try to talk about these issues and keep the conversation going,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a website that they can go out and touch base on?
Absolutely. I'm available, and I do answer the emails on that website. So I'm
Okay.
available at www.brian-reisinger.com. That's Brian, Brian Reisinger, Reisinger.com. And we've got information on the book. We've got stories from the farm. We got more on the farm as well. And like I say, I don't have any robots on there. I'm behind the email if you shoot me a note. So.
Well, it's been absolutely terrific talking to you, Brian, and I wish you great success with the book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more Clarity from Chaos shows on demand, go to clarityfromchaos.buzzsprout.com or send Dave an email at info@clarityfromchaos.com for information on previous shows. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Twitter, or Google Podcast. Until next time, please remember, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Be well, everyone.